Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Ferim from the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities, and I'm one of the co-conveners of the Noni Jabavu lecture series. Ordinarily, it's convened by my dean, Professor Roos, the dean of the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities, who unfortunately cannot be here today. He's in a meeting as we speak. There's some of you, we're all familiar with a spare wheel. Those of you who've got cars, we all know about cars. We're all familiar with the concept or the principle of a spare wheel. A spare wheel is something which is an imitation of the original, right? So it's, in some cars, it's very small and awkward because it's used in the unlikely event of one of the tires breaking down. So it's meant for temporary use until the proper wheel is being replaced. It's usually an imitation of the original, right? So I'm here as a spare wheel because my dean is not here. So I might not live up to your expectations because I'm just an imitation of the original. So pardon me in advance if I don't live up to those expectations. I'm just stepping in place of my dean. The Noni Jabavu lecture series is kind of a flagship program of the University of Fort Hare. And part of the objectives of the series is to stimulate conversations about the distinctiveness and excellence in the University of Fort Hare. So these seminars usually feature on an invited speaker, and the guest speaker always concentrates on how the social science and humanities, rooted in the histories and cultures of the Eastern Cape, may suggest unique, innovative insights into the trajectories of these disciplines at the University of Fort Hare. We've had speakers such as the inaugural speaker of the lecture series was Prof. Ochela, from the professor in the faculty in the Department of History in the University of Fort Hare. We've had Professor Boravoy. We've had even a Nobel Peace Laureate, Professor Abdul Razak Gona. So today we are pleased. I'm just trying to welcome you all and introducing you to the lecture. I'm going to introduce the guest speaker before. Just some housekeeping issues. There are toilets somewhere in the passage. I think the male toilet is somewhere to the right. The female toilet is somewhere to the left. And before we continue, I'm going to call on a representative from the Noni Jabavu family. We were privileged when we extended the invitation to them for them to accept us to use their icon to name the lecture series in the University of Fort Hare. And it's in that tradition we always invite them during our lectures to come and say a word as representative of the family. So I'm going to call the representative of the family right now to give a word on the family and the Noni Jabavu Foundation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all well on this very, very cold day, but I think today God has been gracious to us and given us a bit of sun. So before you, I am Yolisa Jabavu Ndlovu. I'm the great-great-granddaughter of John Tengo Jabavu. And so I'm here with Umamu Ntomboxolo Jabavu. So she is married into the Jabavu family. So you see how warm and lovely people are, that even the people who are married to our family want to come. So we are here, because for us, what the University of Fort Hare is doing today is very important to us as a family. It's important that we not just come and listen, but we come and engage with the community. Earlier this year, we started, so we have established an institute. It's called the Jabavu Institute. And the main purpose really behind it is that we want to preserve, the rich heritage and legacy that we have been left with. There has been a bit of a gap and a lull. And so as the sixth generation, we came together. And part of the work that we're doing is putting together a family tree, because we find that the information that is on the internet is incorrect. And at sometimes, just missing. There's information on the internet that is missing around the Jabavus. If you look on the internet, it shows JT, John Tengo Jabavu, just had one son, DDT, and only then just had one grandchild, Noni Jabavu, and the rest of the Jabavu family no longer exists. But I'm here to tell you that we exist. I'm here to say that, John Tengo had 4 sons, was married twice, so had 4 sons from his first marriage and had 3 daughters from his second marriage. And so DDT is his eldest son from his first marriage, and Unoni then is the eldest daughter of DDT, and Noni Jabavu had a child, and that child had 2 sons. And those 2 sons also have children. So Noni Jabavu has descendants. So it has not stopped there. We're here to say that, it's important for us that the family is humanized, that you realize that, as much as they did great work, but they had siblings, that there were wives, there were daughters, there were, grandchildren, grandfathers and grandmothers. And so as the bigger family, we still exist. And some of the family traits, what you'll find interesting, for example, I wanted to do journalism before even understanding the contribution that JT and Unoni made within the journalism industry. And so the family, and when you talk to everyone else, you realize, hey, we still have the journalists, we have lawyers, we have politicians, we have teachers, and so all the work that JT did with his sons, so the work that John Tengo Jabavu did with his sons, he did not do the work alone, because DDT went on to become more involved in the University of Fort Hare. His son, Alexander, and Rose Ines, they became involved in Imvoza Bansondo, that is celebrating 140 years this year. And so his children were involved in the work that he was doing. So we're here to say that we are here in any shape or form that you may be researching and want to know things around the family. And so we have formed the Jabavu Institute. One, we want to be more visible. We want the legacy to continue. We want a deeper and better relationship with the University of Fort Hare. And so we really do thank you that you extended this invitation and ensured that we are here today. And we do have other family members that would have joined us today, but life is lifing, so things are not always perfect. And so with that said, I do want to thank you so much for inviting us. We're really looking forward to Prof. We had great conversations already around family and heritage. And so thank you so much for today and extending the invitation to us.
Thanks to the Noni Jabavu family representative for that quite enlightening and overview of the rich history of the Noni Jabavu family. I think part of these talks, the purpose of these talks is to ensure that there's a link between academic discourse and the community, because academics usually operate in silos. They go to the communities, they extract data, they publish their papers, and life goes on. So I think part of the idea is to ensure that this sophistication of the academic discourse has relevance to the immediate communities. And there has to be a relationship between local communities and the universities, and vice versa, because in any event, local communities are the repositories of knowledge. So they have to be part and parcel of the research management process, right? Without saying much, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker for today. She's Professor Leslie Green. She's a professor of anthropology and co-founder of Environmental Humanities at the University of Cape Town, Environmental Humanities South at the University of Cape Town. She currently serves as the director and is leading its curriculum innovation to develop transdisciplinary and African environmental scholarship. And now the program is in its 9th year, and it has hosted students from 19 African countries and supports the emergence of African eco-politics. Professor Green is a former Fulbright scholar at the Science and Justice Research Center at the University of California and at Santa Cruz. She's a Mandela Fellow at Harvard. She's a Rockefeller Humanities Fellow at Smithsonian and Cheney Fellow at the University of Leeds School of Earth and Environment. Her research focuses on justice-based environmental governance sciences in Southern Africa. A particular interest is in the relationship between science and democracy in the Global South, where there are contests over knowledge. As a former council member of the Society for Social Studies of Science, she is active in global science studies dialogues and was recently awarded a $4 million four-year grant by Science for Africa for a 6-country project along Africa's Indian Ocean coast to develop an African critical zone social science scholarship in partnership with South Africa's Human Sciences Research Council. She is the editor of Contested Ecologies, Dialogues in the South on Nature and Knowledge, co-author of Knowing the Day, Knowing the World, and author of Rock, Water, Life, Ecology and Humanities for a Decolonizing South Africa, which won the Humanities Book Prize awarded by the Academy of Science of South Africa in 2023. A forthcoming collection titled Contested Ecologies 2, African Eco-Politics of Dignity and Desire, which is co-edited by Leslie Green, that's her, Frank Matos, Anselmo Matus, and Nikiwe Solomon will be out later this year or earlier in later this year. So, Professor Green, that's a mouthful. so welcome to the University of Fort Hare. Welcome to the Noni Jabavu lecture series. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. What an honor to be here. Thank you for your time. And thank you to the Jabavu family for your warm welcome and for putting together this really important lecture series. So our team at the University of Cape Town in the Humanities faculty is working to build a decolonial environmentalism, specifically to build an African environmentalism in partnership with colleagues from several African countries and students from many countries. So it's a real honor to speak in the name of Noni Jabavu, who traveled this coast between here and Nairobi a lot and wrote about it. And to speak in the Eastern Cape, which she loved and wrote about too. In her columns from the Daily Dispatch in 1977, which were recently published in A Stranger at Home, thanks to Makosazana Kaba and Atambile Masola, she really shows how she had that ability to connect worlds. Her columns from the Daily Dispatch just connect things. She's got that eye for detail and an eye for the tiny interactions that mark the difference between being treated with dignity and respect and being treated with indignity and disaffection. But she could laugh. She was clearly irrepressible. And that irrepressibility, I think, is crucial. I'll come back to that. And the journeys that she was taking between the Eastern Cape, Europe, and Africa were in East Africa were journeys of connection, of humanity and dignity, even in the time of verwoerd. And I think her work is that big picture inspiration that we need now as we try to build an environmental governance that is African and where people are not strangers at home, whether they be involved in struggles over mineral sands or struggles over offshore gas or struggles over cobalt in Congo, that environmentalism is not putting people off their land, because environmentalism ultimately is about connecting, about not being a stranger at home. So what strikes me so much about Noni Jabavu's work is that she insisted on her dignity, she insisted on being present in the space, despite the structures of society that would compel her absence. And I think that struggle that she faced then remains a struggle that many Africans face now in the midst of climate crisis, where environmental governance so often is about forcing people off land for all sorts of reasons. So the story of homecoming, of returning to land, is one of the most important stories of our time in our country, where the land struggles have not been resolved. And it's a time where our planetary home is in trouble. Scientists speak of the sixth great extinction as being driven by another phrase, an interesting one, the great alienation, the alienation from land, the alienation from earth, alienation from oceans. And that alienation has got a history within modernity and coloniality, where as the rise of private land ownership grew, people were forced off the land, whether in Europe or here or Asia or Latin America, people were being forced off the land. And here we are in a climate crisis, in a planetary crisis, where people don't feel at home on the planet. And our universities are part of that. We still teach science and social science separately. And yet the very nature of the climate crisis tells us that humans are earth-forming. We have a role to play on the planet and the planet's functioning. So one of the most crucial issues in decolonial scholarship, as I see it, is to address this fictitious divide between humans and planet, between people and earth, between people and land. And paradoxically, even though we are in this time where we are having to think about how do we actually recognize that we are not extraterrestrial, we are part of the earth. Despite we've got a history of 400 years or more of universities separating out humans and planet, humans from nature, that we are in this moment where we are coming home, and yet despite that, we are in a time where in places like the shores of Cabo Delgado, north of here in Mozambique, people are still being forced off land. I want to go over the story of how that has happened, and how environmental sciences have been a crucial part of that, because I think that raises the crucial question for us within our universities of how do we rethink this inheritance of a crazy idea that is part of the problem of now, where humans live as if we're not part of the planet. So what does this homecoming look like? So in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, Africa's east coast, like here, slips under the warm waters of the ocean. And that same ocean appeared in palm-lined beaches on colonial stamps. Cabo Delgado was listed as the Mozambique Company. Post-Mozambican War, the same palm-lined beach appears in tourist brochures, again, presenting itself as a paradise of earthly connection, where you can go on holiday to reconnect with the earth and reconnect with yourself. But in 2013, Cabo Delgado moved from the tourist headlines, tourist brochures, to headlines of a different kind when it was announced that offshore gas had been found in an incomprehensible quantity. It was one of the biggest gas discoveries in history. And Mozambique rapidly approved 3 extraction projects. But between 2016 and 2019, those headlines changed again, and this time in relation to extreme violence. 300 violent events were recorded between 2016 and 2019. Almost 1,000 people were killed, many brutally, and many, many more were injured. And yet, at the same time, 2019, 2020, as this was happening, the African Development Bank declared that the Cabo Delgado project advanced 3 of its high fives. Its high fives are to light up and power Africa, feed Africa, industrialize Africa, integrate Africa, and improve the quality of life of Africa. And they announced this project was open for business, and they signed off on a $400 million loan to finance the project. But the failure of the bank's decision-making process couldn't be more starkly illustrated than a call in April this year by the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs for another amount, the same amount, 400 million, being requested once again, this time in emergency aid for the refugees this year, where as of January, as the project started to scale up again, almost 1 million people became on the move again, and there was a need for emergency aid. So the African Development Bank's decision was made on the basis of scientific recommendations, of the acceptance of an environmental and social impact assessment. That environmental and social impact assessment done between 2013 and 2017 is 5,000 pages long. And I think it's not an unreasonable criticism to say that if you've done 5,000 pages of environmental and social impact assessment and you haven't foreseen conflict that erupts, something was missing in the way you did your study. And I think this study is key for us in our universities in this continent as we try to think, what does an African environmentalism mean? What does a homecoming environmentalism mean? So let's just go into that project a little bit. The project required massive gas processing plants. Now it's very interesting to note that 3 gas contracts were awarded, one of which was to an entirely offshore project, which is still going on, where the gas processing is being done on board a gas vessel. They didn't take land, but the other 2 joined forces and declared that they required the entire Afungi Peninsula, which is just on the south of Tanzania, on the Mozambique and Tanzanian border. What they did there was they declared that they required 16,000 acres of this Afungi Peninsula, which required clearing around 5 villages, multiple farms. That 16,000 acres was enclosed in 2 parallel 12-foot tall fences, inside of which contractors built a port, an airport, a street grid, a power station, a water plant, an emergency room, a cafeteria, a bar, a gym, hundreds of ensuite cabins for Total's managers, all arranged in rows, connected by covered walkways and strung with streetlights. Next, huge tracts outside of Fungi would be transformed into 6 giant workers' camps, thousands of 4-bed cabins, plus washrooms and mess halls to sleep a labor force of 15,000. But multiple studies going along at the same time found that local people were increasingly unhappy because they were all left out of the procurement chain, which had overwhelmingly gone to Mozambican elites and foreign operators. This stoked an incredible sense of dissatisfaction, a sense that Frelimo had failed local people. And at the same time, it was fanning the tensions between Shia preachers and Sunni Muslims that was actually being published about on the basis of 2 years of in-depth social science. There was an article published about this in the East African Journal, the Journal of East African Studies. But at this very moment where the decision is being made about this investment, this article is being published warning that there is tremendous tension, religious tension on the ground. And that study, social science study, is ignored. So in February 2021, the Mozambique Liquefied National Gas Project were then awarded the Global Multilateral Deal of the Year 2020 by Project Finance International, which calls itself the leading source of intelligence on global project finance. And this was because the project at this point was a $24 billion project, which was understood to, quote, unlock greater economic growth for Mozambique and benefit millions of people in the country while building climate resilience, international best practice, women's empowerment, and job creation. One has to wonder at the boardroom cosmology, because to promote climate resilience, the bank would have to offset carbon emissions of 100 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. In terms of current carbon calculation mechanisms, this would require a forest of 6.5 billion acres, or about a sixth of the planet's entire landmass, which Google tells me is the whole of Russia plus a whole lot of Canada. Moreover, when this press statement was released in February 2021, the Russian military group Wagner had already been overwhelmed together with the Mozambican army. So both of them had already withdrawn, and this statement was issued that this project was going to benefit everybody. Nobody was rethinking the picture because this authority of science was in place. The environmental and social impact assessment provided the political authority to move ahead. So one has to ask, why was there no point at which that environmental and social impact assessment was questioned by the bankers, by government officials, the consulting sciences, or the oil companies? Why did the African Development Bank not call for caution in order to avoid harm to African lives and livelihoods? So after further violence, intense violence, Total Energies temporarily suspended operations in December 2021 and appointed a human rights consultancy to make some recommendations. 3 months later, Total Energies said they would resume construction, and within 3 days, a major attack on the town of Palma killed 1,193. Kidnappings soared to 209, and Mozambican women reported brutal experiences in rape camps. 3 days later, Total Energies declared force majeure, which implies the equivalent of an act of God and is used to indicate, it's a legal term that says this was unforeseeable. And yet, there was this environmental and social impact assessment of almost 5,000 pages. How is it that the conflict was unforeseeable when that much research has been done? But the reality is that the worsening of the conflict was actually not unforeseen in the boardroom, because after the force majeure declaration, Friends of the Earth USA, in cooperation with Mozambican community organizations, applied to a US court for access to documents held by the US Investment Bank, XM, under the Freedom of Information Act. And in that set of documents, which I've read, an August 2019 document notes that the bank had minuted, quote, Mozambique presents a rapidly evolving security dynamic. Security threats will evolve rapidly and the situation will worsen before it improves. In other words, the document explicitly notes that their $5 billion US investment would put Mozambican communities at risk. The boardroom discussion is minuted and a decision is made to improve the fencing. So the documents also suggest that a Cold War-style geopolitics was a factor, and the US government was struggling, this was under Trump at the time, to displace funding efforts by China and Russia with American money and influence. And in other words, what we're seeing is proxy wars playing out via investors, much as Kwame Nkrumah had written about in West Africa in the 1960s and 70s. Violence had been forewarned by Friends of the Earth, but the report had been dismissed by the bank as being critical. Nowhere in the EIA was the risks of conflict noted by any of the consultants, even though there was a history of conflict in the area over multiple development projects, whether they be over cotton or rubies or graphite. Even though they were advising on a major resettlement project that would move 5 whole villages into, there were Christian villages would now move, the majority Muslim villages were now being required to move into majority Christian villages. That those fishers were now being required to make livelihoods inland, that those moving would be given new houses, but those who were giving up fields would get nothing, that people in the area had suffered repeated wars, and that there was this incredibly fragile trust between local villagers and super wealthy Frelimo elite. In other words, as a social scientist, all the signals were there for massive conflict to break out, for things to erupt. But this was not noted by the environmental and social impact assessment. So one has to ask then, why did the herpetologists, the botanists, the ornithologists, the soil scientists, and so on, all these scientists whose scientific expertise was used to authorize the project, why were they unable to contest this plan that was so clearly destructive of landscape life and livelihoods? And I think this comes to another problem in our universities. We don't do big picture science. We do big science, but where's the big picture science? The science that allows us to bring all the disciplines together in a peer-reviewable way. We don't have centers within our universities that do that. So over the last 100 years or so, more and more disciplines have evolved, and our disciplines are more and more fragmented. So thus the water study is done, the soil study is done, the bird study is done, the lizard study is done, the frog study is done, and the people moving study is done. But nobody's putting all of those pieces together to say there's a big picture here. So the big picture is being left to the corporate boardroom. It's not peer reviewable. And I think our universities have got a lot to answer for. We have to take back the big picture. We have to start looking at how do we do big picture science. So the Maputo study for Maputo-based Center for Democracy and Development notes that violent extremism in Cabo Delgado was not just from an incursion across the border, as many of our newspapers tell us, but that youth were radicalized in the context of extreme poverty, inequality, exclusion, which this development took away access to means of livelihood. And once the attacks began, the government's response was predominantly military and very overbearing, which in turn was a gift to the extremist groups, because as the heavy-handed military response took place against local people, the extremist groups were able to gather more and more support. So, and Civil War specialist Joseph Hanlon tells us that this civil war took place in the same areas where the 1964-74 independence war in Mozambique began. And he notes that there are many similarities. First, he says, every civil war has a grievance which is so deeply felt that people are prepared to kill their neighbors. Second, nearly all civil wars involve foreign actors supporting different sides. In Cabo Delgado, the 64-74 independence war began because colonial authorities were seen to be taking the wealth of the area and leaving nothing behind. Resources were the grievance, and the Mozambican Liberation Front waved the flag of independence as a way to fairer shares. Frelimo is now the government, he says, and people along the coast see themselves as marginalized by the elite. When the insurgency began, farmers, fishers, and artisanal miners joined in the fighting as they had been displaced. The grievance, he says, was the same in both wars. Independence had been the flag 50 years earlier. This time, the flag was a particular form of Islam. A lot of independent research was taking place over this time to try and make sense of this insurgency. Was it, in fact, a major Islamic insurgency? All the on-the-ground social science research that I've read that was being done at the time indicates that there were very weak links between ISIS Mozambique and ISIS globally. Since then, it's come together, and the increasingly are joining forces. But in the beginning, it was not an external insurgency. It was a local thing. But the Human Rights Report is also very interesting because there's some things that are just extraordinary. One of the major grievances the Human Rights Report noted was that 12% of the land from which communities had been removed had been allocated to a Texas-based business called Sunshine Nuts, which was taking over the cashew trees that villagers had. So they took over the cashew trees, and those nuts you can now buy on Amazon.com or Whole Foods USA. So they were being exported. The Human Rights Report noted how unhappy people were because not only were the nuts being exported, but it was a Christian evangelical mission in a Muslim area. In the report, it's very interesting to see the theory of the human that's playing out. And I think this is key for us in the social sciences in our attempts to have dialogue with the natural sciences over what does justice-based environmental governance look like going forward. And it strikes me that throughout the report, I'm seeing a couple of theories of the human and theories of society that I think we in the social sciences really need to take on and contest in our engagements with colleagues in the natural sciences who are driving environmental governance. First of all, there's this idea that society just functions as a system and that conflict is unusual, it's an anomaly. But as a social scientist, conflict is part of life. Secondly, they see social science as simply doing behavioral economics. What are the financialized incentives that you can put out in front of people? And that's the role of social science. And with that goes the theory that people are Homo Economicus. People are just simply motivated by finance, by financialized economy and money. But of course, all of us who have lived in villages on this continent know that money is one motivation, but it's not the only motivation. People live for home, live for dignity, live for relationships, and kinds of support that build an economy are not simply financial. And there's this assumption that fossil fuel dollars are going to fix poverty, which they see as a cultural condition, not a condition arising from the impoverishment of Africa through global debt. So that cluster of ideas has got a name in the social sciences, Homo Economicus. And its consequences is imagining society like a monopoly board. And over, reading this environmental and social impact assessment, one gets the sense that the advisors are simply are thinking of people like little houses on a monopoly board. You just move the houses and everything will be fine, without regarding the incredible tensions and difficulties that was going to foster. When these are raised in the comment section of the environmental impact assessment, there's a familiar word cluster. Words like closely monitoring, aware of the risks, we have a plan, the MOU set out certain requirements, that's beyond the scope, and so on. There's this language of corporate spin. But over time, that corporate spin was going to turn into a vortex that put to flight almost 1 million people, and by 2022 had led to 4,000 deaths. Now, the backstory of this project is debt. Mozambique's debt had ballooned between 2009 and 2013 to 25 billion, which at that point was 160% of Mozambique's GDP. It was the highest of any country in the world. And in 2016, there was the revelation that Mozambican officials had taken a further $2 billion in loans without the approval of Parliament. And that caused an outcry in the World Bank and IMF sector, and it almost forced Mozambique into bankruptcy. Its investment grade dropped to default, and international donors cut their funding. Then World Bank documents began to present the gas bonanza as a way for Mozambique to pay its debts, which for the most part were for post-war reconstruction, post-colonial reconstruction, and climate reconstruction, bearing in mind that Cyclone Kenneth and Idai had hit in 2019. So IMF-led debt restructuring in 2019 depended on natural gas production. And now here's the key. The promise of natural gas production postponed the increase in interest on national debts for 5 years. Now, if you're sitting with something north of $25 billion, a tiny increase in interest rate is going to have a massive increase. The proposal was that the interest rate would stay at 5% until 2024, when it would increase to 9%. So if you can imagine the impact of increasing from 5% to 9% on a $25 billion loan, it's massive. So there's been enormous pressure this year to get that project back up and running, and try to persuade the global finance community to keep that interest rate down. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing, in fact, the debt owed by Mozambique in 2022 had shot up to $64 billion. So what is $64 billion? It's actually not that much money if you put it next to the $38 trillion that Forbes says was the post-COVID wealth increase of the world's billionaires. 38 trillion, when we're talking about the wealth increase, we're not talking about capital. The wealth increase of the world's couple of thousand billionaires, 38 trillion from 2020 to the end of 2023. That wealth increase is 4 times the entire debt of all the lower and middle income countries, according to World Bank figures released in 2022. So if we took wealth tax back to 2012 levels by 2030, says Oxfam, that would release 24 trillion into the global economy, which would be enough to cover the entire debt of lower and middle income countries and release the pressure for extractive projects like this. In other words, the wealth tax discussion is part of our environmentalism. It's part of the history of this continent. It's part of global justice. Redesigning, tell them I say hi. Redesigning the global financial architecture was called for by the UN General Secretary, Antonio Guterres, in June last year, where he said the current global financial architecture is unsustainable. It prevents countries in the lower and middle income groups from being able to invest in the sustainable development goals, and it forces people into extractivist projects like we see in Mozambique. In other words, we come to a very interesting conclusion here. Amilcar Cabral, one of the greatest thinkers of the continent, started out his career as a soil scientist. There's a fat book of about 750 pages of Cabral's soil science studies that he did before he went back to West Africa and started his revolutionary work. His argument was that if Africa wanted sovereignty, we had to look to our soils. We had to look to the connection with land. His argument was, in Portuguese, to defend the earth is to defend the human. He's putting together human well-being with planetary well-being. An African environmentalism that is about homecoming to the earth, homecoming to land, can well begin with the work of Cabral to relink with land, to look at building sovereignty in relation to an environmentalism that takes care of our own habitability. So studying this Cabo Delgado environmental and social impact assessment has taught me this, that we are using 21st century scientific methods in disciplines designed in the 18th century. They're using a satellite image, geospatial work, extraordinary technologies go into this environmental impact assessment, but the conversation does the opposite of what Cabral calls for. It doesn't put people and planet together, it keeps them apart. So much of our environmentalism is based on the idea that humans are the enemy, And in a country like ours, that translates very, very quickly into a racist agenda. So, to build on African environmentalism means taking on the injustice of the global economy. It means taking on the ideas that still claim that environmentalism means separating people from Earth. And it means taking on the logics of gross domestic product. These are the kind of things that can build habitability. How crucial this is again, comes to us from Cabo Delgado, which was hit not once but twice in April 2019 with 2 massive cyclones caused by climate crisis. We can't afford on this East African coast that is so vulnerable to cyclones and extreme weather events, we can't afford to not take climate change seriously. We can build an African environmentalism that takes on global debt structures, that says Africa should not have the debt load that it has, that the global financial architecture should be restructured so that we can restructure our environments and do the sustainable development that we need to be doing. So an African environmentalism starts with reclaiming those relationships between people and land and people and planet, and defending those who are made to feel strangers at home. The legacy of Noni Jabavu, as so beautifully told in A Stranger at Home, invites us to tell that new story, conversation by conversation, moment by moment, to reclaim those connections with home. Thank you very much. Shall I be seated?
That was, I want to thank Prof. Green for that detailed presentation on gas discovery and conflict in Mozambique. It's quite a pity that whenever a substance of value is discovered in the African continent and beyond, conflicts always tend to escalate. We saw this happen with diamonds in Sierra Leone, oil in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, and now there is gas discoveries in Mozambique and conflict. I hear gas has been discovered in neighboring Namibia, oil, I think. I hope it doesn't go down that route. That's in political sense, we call it the resource curse, wherein an abundance of resources always translates into political instability and economic stagnation. We have to look for more creative ways of protecting our environment, protecting the earth. There's a CNN advert which says that humans cannot exist without nature, but nature can exist without humans. So it's very important for us to protect our environment. So thank you, Prof. Green, once again for that very insightful lecture. As is the tradition with the Noni Jabavu lectures, we are going to have 2 respondents to the presentation. One is about implications for teaching, and the other one is about implications for research. So I'm going to call on the first respondent, Mr. Gideon Tebit from the Department of Communication, to come and respond to the presentation. Mr. Tebit, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ferry. Good morning. Perhaps I should also start with a caveat. You heard Dr. Ferim say he's a spare, so he just came here to represent his dean. I am sure in his very fine office, he had also sat there and looked around the university and looked for somebody fitting to respond to this deep lecture, and they probably had rejections and rejections here and there. So, I know this guy in communication. Let me call him. After all, he's a journalist. He can speak like that. So I am not. I would rather talk like a journalist first. So most of my commentary would be editorializing, not necessarily the teaching component that comes in. So if you allow me, let me just dig in. When I first got exposed to the lecture, I took a quick peek at the title. I'm talking about a soft copy when it was shared, and then a cursory tour at the preamble pages. The force majeure section, as Professor Green aptly described it, and my excitement went boom. I was greeted by these very beautiful words and combination of words that I'm not ashamed to say now that I've not been exposed to. Anthropocene, dogmas and networks of the blue glass cosmos, boardroom cosmology. There were some interesting Latinisms there too. Well, most prefixed with the Homo Economicus and Homo Sedimenter argument that after listening to the lecture is central to the African environmentalism that he talks very profoundly about. And as I read further, it became progressively clearer that I was digesting something really special. It was only when I got to ignorance majeure that I had to pause and see who the writer was. I'd just gone to the lecture. And true to the nature of the presenter herself, a leading thinker in transdisciplinary studies, the lecture cuts across many disciplines: environmental studies, politics, international relations, sociology, natural science, and how that fits into climate Earth, and presents lots of opportunities for our teaching and learning efforts here at Fort Hare. In my opinion, the lecture answers a resounding yes to, and sits quite comfortably as a good example of how best to respond to the trendy, albeit existentially necessary, call for African teachers and scholars such as ourselves to work towards decolonizing epistemology and our thought processes, and of course to help unearth indigenous knowledge ecologies in Africa. If I have to continue editorializing, I couldn't help recalling similar warnings that the American scholar Noam Chomsky had alerted us in Manufactured Concerns, his musings during the global debates prior to the invasion of Iraq. At the time, the then government of the United States direly needed coalition support from the rest of the 196 UN member states to attack Iraq. We can all now remember how that was sold, particularly in our neoliberal press. Well, we now know that no weapons of mass destruction was ever found in Iraq, but the attacks did happen. Well, moving on, I find every little part of the lecture profoundly edifying. I particularly enjoy how the talk beautifully transitioned through the various majeurs: force majeure, ignorance majeure, and of course, philosophie majeure, with each section skillfully grounded on an axiology of knowledge, value system that transcends many disciplines. But guess what? Despite all this, I still had to train myself to curb my enthusiasm a little and to wait for the actual lecture. Understandably, I couldn't quite conclude from just reading the content of the lecture. I had to experience the art form itself. And gee whiz, her calm certainty, her ability to ask profound questions in a very nicely direct way, beautifully contrasts the wealth of knowledge that she oozes clearly. I enjoyed every moment. True to the nature of the presenter herself, a leading thinker in disciplinary study that I mentioned, the conflict or social unrest in the Cabo Delgado province of Mozambique, wrongfully and painfully told as it were, stated clearly by the presenter, in my opinion, is merely just an extension of the many other colonial and post-colonial struggles that many communities of the continent, blessed with natural resources yet cursed with terrible leadership, are grappling with, especially the difficulty to fully appreciate the dictates of modern-driven neoliberal dispensation. Most folks miss this one because it was hidden in COVID world and completely submerged by the COVID-19 news at the time. So we didn't hear of the amount of killings that happened, well, except people that consume the media quite frequently. From Kivu and the Kasai provinces in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Bangui in the Central African Republic, the Niger Delta region in the Federal Republic of Nigeria with the Ogoni activists, the Marikana in South Africa, if you allow me, the hot plots of uranium mines in Niamey in the Republic du Niger, the new, although very somber oil fields of the new two Sudans, and to a very large extent, the current insecurity challenges around the northwest and southwest regions, the so-called Ambazonia region of La République du Cameroon, where new oil prospects have emerged, African communities continue to fail themselves. They continue to create and nurture conflicts, and they continue to refuse to learn from mistakes. I particularly enjoyed how the lecture fuses philosophy, the natural sciences, and the environment, how it challenges us to reimagine our role in the planet, all the while reminding us, as in the various sectors of the polity, to continuously seek common understanding between those who live in Earth and of Earth, and to us at Fort Hare. If I were to paraphrase the presenter, embrace a critical zones approach based on habitability at the local governance level, and to leverage its potential to re-empower local publics, build knowledge of local landscapes. In our case, we are trying with the Noni Jabavu lecture series here, but we could take it way deeper into our various areas, to assert value, to think collectively, and to work collectively to restore Earth process. Here is where I got a little worried. Prof. Green, in reimagining the actual human between the idealistic Homo Economicus and the Homo Sedimenta divide that you used Danowski and De Castro to explain, the aspect of determinism quickly comes to my mind. Sorry, I can't find my notes. Quickly comes to mind. Sorry. Sorry, I've just lost my train of thought here. It came to my mind. Okay, I can. Sorry. Oh. No, there's some mistake here. No. Anyway, I'll continue talking. So the aspect of determinism comes to my mind. O'Sullivan and Wood had argued that it's a single factor that determines the outcome of events, such as the Cabo Delgado situation. But I ask myself, just from my lived experience in the continent and the readings that I've done too, is if, I don't know if you ask yourself this, Prof, if the Mozambican authority had not ignored the warnings of Friends of the Earth, had not paid the experts that came with that 5,000 words report to see what they wanted them to see. For argument's sake, all the other faux pas that we saw the Mozambican authority made before the conflict, if all those were taken care of, let's take it a step further. Even if we were to swap the roles, the indigents that felt marginalized, taking over from the Frelimo elites, would we really see anything different in the continent of Africa? Because over the years, we've seen cases where revolutions have actually changed, and the new sets of the agents continue to play the same symphony with a different orchestra now, but reading from the same playbook. Those were the thoughts that I kept asking, and in that thought process, I thought maybe one of the people that would understand this better is Ali Mazrui, when he spoke about the Africans. And I dare say, maybe we should take our understanding of the Mozambican the Cabo Delgado situation in Mozambique and understanding Afro-environmentalism in that context by taking a step further and understanding the people. Hislop spoke about, and his colleagues, they spoke about Southern Africa post-Mfekane, and the new writings that have come up where they found the spirit of the African that left the Zulu kraals, Soshangani, and now moved to Mozambique and the other surrounding areas. Some of them have even washed into, you mentioned here, Zanzibar, Tanzania, and some areas there. Perhaps the main argument should be that that's a country that was found on rebellion itself, because the very same people that left here with Mfekane being chased by the Shaka Kingdom were themselves people that are a little rebellious. That's why they happen to be the only place in Africa where I know that the influence of ISIS and Al-Shabaab has been branded as the main cause. But was it really the main cause? Yeah, he has a role, and that's where determinism I mentioned comes in. He had a role, but was it really the main cause? Was it not just because the people themselves were generally people that a nation that was built out of revolt? I just asked that, and I end there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Tebet. We will now call on our second respondent, Dr. Chris Alsobrook. He's from the Center for Leadership Ethics in Africa, and while he's coming on to the podium, I just want to say, Prof. Green is going to reflect on the or perhaps respond to both respondents. And one of the things that also came in mind when Mr. Tebet was talking is that some realists who have very negative, pessimistic outlook on life argued that history is a repetitive cycle of violence because mankind is materialistic. Men fight for gain, for glory, for safety, for security. So, Dr. Alsobrook, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Valerie. And thank you, Prof. Green, for a fascinating talk about the botched gas extraction project at Cabo Delgado. So we've heard ongoing stories of this conflict along the coast at Cabo Delgado over the past several years. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, in fact 1 million, displaced in this region. Although about half have returned due to the military intervention by the Southern African forces and Rwandan troops. But they've not been well funded, and it seems it's only temporarily stabilized the situation, and they're busy withdrawing at the very moment, and I wouldn't be surprised if the conflict spreads again. With Islamic State taking control of much of northern Mozambique. So with the situation having been going on for a long time, why was this not picked up in the social and environmental impact assessment? Was it not in the interests of the people who wrote these assessments? For decades there's been simmering conflict in northern Mozambique due to the socioeconomic marginalization of people living in this region. And everyone has known for at least the past 20 years that you don't go on holiday up at the very north. you stop at a certain point. So if everyone knows that, just out of hearsay, for a major oil company to come in and set up operations without paying adequate attention to the volatile regional social dynamics in this region. It reflects the remarkable arrogance, ignorance, and carelessness with which they customarily operate. They're used to doing it this way and getting away with it. So when social and environmental impact assessments are undertaken, it's clear that the interests of local communities are seen as an inconvenience by corrupt elites who don't want to hear those stories. And politicians often sing praises about the economic benefits of these operations, but then it's only a wealthy few that benefit while the livelihoods of local people are disrupted. So Leslie's work sheds light not just on the complicity of corrupted political leaders who aid and abet the neo-colonial behavior of these multinational corporations, but also about the complicit role of academics and scientists. While a lot of lip service is paid in the academy to the rhetoric of decolonization, environmentalism, social justice, in reality, we're constantly reminded by our employers that our real job is numbers. Our real job is numbers. Numbers of students graduated, numbers of publications, numbers of grants with big numbers on them, and big publication and citation and citations and citation indices. So it's difficult to avoid the impression of complicity when we are so incentivized to generate impressive sounding words about important matters of substance which satisfy the demands of funding bodies to generate appeasing stories for their PR profiles. And as you're no doubt aware, there's been an ongoing battle here in the Eastern Cape, along the Wild Coast, responding to Shell's intentions to explore for gas offshore. We can just imagine we don't want this story that happened in northern Mozambique to be happening down here. So far it's been prevented by environmental activists and by communities whose lives will be disrupted, and they know it, because it's been happening in South Africa for hundreds of years. But we should also not romanticize the public backlash when multi-billion-dollar opportunities arise with natural resource extraction booms. So more often than not, we get criminal syndicates posing as local business forums, making sure that they benefit from the investment, and they're willing to hold it back until they get a cut. That's often the activism. Throughout South Africa, we've got social, what do you call them, construction mafias holding back development because they want a cut. And everyone is compromised. Everyone is compromised to some extent. So many environmental activists fly around the world, drive nice cars, and live destructive bourgeois lives. And Noni Jabavu and her renowned middle-class father, the Fort Hare College professor, DDT Jabavu, and her politically influential grandfather, news editor John Tango Jabavu, have likewise been sidelined in history by liberation struggle historians for being on the wrong side of the class divide. The Jabavus, one might argue, like many academics and activists, were compromised by their class positionality. And like Mandela and Ramaphosa, we can set them alongside the Ama-respectables, whose good manners pleased the elites. Noni Jabavu benefited tremendously from the respectability of her middle-class upbringing and the high-profile contacts made by her father and grandfather, who made a living as the civilized face of political protest. And likewise, the tremendous work of Professor Leslie Green, exposing the abuse of power and the destruction of communities and natural environment, has been well rewarded with sizable grant funding, highly cited publications, and academic accolades. So can we say that this work is equally compromised? This would be a mistake and a lazy conclusion. Like Noni Jabavu, Leslie Green is a highly educated middle-class activist working in a compromised academic environment that typically sells out to big numbers. But such complex positionality does not put such expertise into an easily defined camp. Despite their privileged influence, we need to look at the details of what they have done with this influence. We need to pay careful attention to the fine details, for instance, of 5,000 pages of text in the environmental impact assessment to distinguish academic blurb from significant details. It's the ability to put these details and these numbers into context and perspective. The painstaking framing of such complexities in simple, relatable terms, the big picture. The big picture sounds easy, but there's a lot of background work that goes into telling that big picture in a coherent way that brings home the sense and the madness of these confusing, destructive activities, which we hear about off the wild coast in northern Mozambique. So we often get lost in the complex numbers of compromised, greedy, destructive political economy, and we forget what these numbers stand for, and we rely on the expertise of influential, educated academics to tell us what these details mean and why it matters. And there's plenty of highly educated academics writing highly detailed reports on such social, political, and environmental concerns, which no one reads or understands. In the cases of writers and scientists like Noni Jabavu and Leslie Green, who really tell it like it is, bring this home, are rare. And when we're fortunate enough to hear from them, we all need to pay a lot more attention. So thank you for bringing this home to us today. Thank you.
As we wrap up, I appreciate the contestations. I'm sure Prof. Green is well versed with how contested the academics, how contested academic spaces can be. Sometimes very polarizing. So I will expect her to respond to some of the issues that have been raised. But before she responds, are there any questions so that she has a consolidated response to all the issues that have been raised by the respondents? Are there any questions from anyone on the floor? Okay, there are no questions, so we are going to call on Prof. Green. And I'll just like her to reflect a bit on her experiences of conducting research in a conflict zone as she responds to the two respondents. Prof. Green, thank you.
Thanks very much for really thoughtful comments, both of you. Much appreciated. I want to start with your nation built out of revolt. That's such a complex question, and you're right, Ali Mazrui speaks to it, so does Frantz Fanon. I recently had I read a lot of books, but I don't finish a lot of books. And one of the books that I finished recently is a 700-page book called White Malice, which is a fascinating book, and it's based on the last 120 pages of it are references to recently declassified CIA documentation from West Africa and Central Africa in the 1960s, where we had the time of the deposition, the coup against Kwame Nkrumah, and the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. The book, you would expect to read with a critical eye, is this just conspiracy theories, etc., etc. But this is an extraordinary text. It was written by a researcher based at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. That itself is no guarantee. But for me, what's compelling is the number of footnotes, where she goes through thousands and thousands of documents and shows the extent to which global struggles, particularly at that time between the Cold War between the USA and the USSR, played a role in that time. I found it extraordinarily compelling, and I think it's a book it's one of those books which changes your perspective on everything. And I think what I see there is, clearly what we see there was proxy wars over access to resources, particularly in the Congo and the Katanga province, where the uranium was not just any uranium, but some of the most potent uranium that you would find anywhere in the world, and the struggle to control it. Notwithstanding the effort of Africa's leaders to strengthen the non-aligned movement and refuse to get involved in this USSR-USA conflict, it was sucked in, and she goes into the details in the archival footnotes of how people were set up against one another, and I think that I've always had this question in my mind: why? Well, not always, but since I started reading about Nkrumah and the Pan-African struggles, what happened between the 1950s and the 1980s? What happened? How did we lose that generation of extraordinary leaders? What happened to them? And I think what was so compelling about that book is it gives me an answer of the extent to which conflict within Africa was fostered by external interests in order to get those resources. I don't have an answer for your question. But I think your question is going to the question of, is Africa playing the same playbook over and over again? Is there something inherent about Africa that means that there is always going to be a resource curse? Having read that book, White Malice, I would be inclined to decline the argument that there's something inherent about Africa that makes Africans fight with one another. And I think the huge role in our current conflicts comes from the debt the global architecture, global financial architecture, which I was trying to sketch earlier. Now, it's not my terrain of expertise, and I'm very happy to dialogue with anybody on this and learn more. But from what I'm seeing is I would profoundly and emphatically agree with Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, who in his second term of office has found his voice and is now speaking and saying we have to redesign global financial architecture because it is putting unreasonable, unbearable, and unviable pressure on lower and middle income countries. And he makes the point in his speech from June last year. He says, at the time when the current global financial architecture was designed post-World War, it was designed to repair Europe post-Second World War. And, he adds, most of the countries in existence in the world today did not exist at that time. And I think that the kind of neo-colonialism that Nkrumah warns about in the books that he was writing point to precisely this kind of a situation. So for me, in terms of trying to answer that question, I'm busy. I'd love to continue the conversation, but I'm looking into what happened 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and the ways in which corrupt governments were encouraged, government corruption was encouraged. And we saw this in this country, where no sooner had the ink had not even yet dried on our documents for our country when the Swedish arms dealers were already coming in with their trades, which we're still struggling with in court. So I think that there's a global elite that has to do with the arms industry and the oil industry that is very, very keen to foster corrupt government. And I think that in the years since the Seattle and the World Trade Organization regulations that came in from the late 1990s that permitted globalization, we've had an intensification of that. So rather than resolving the Cold War conflicts, they've taken a new turn and taken a new form. So my own foray into answering your very important question would be to go down the track not only of looking at Africa, but looking at what's going on in global finance and global politics in the attempt to extract and control Africa's resources. Africa is 23% of terrestrial space on this earth. 23% of the land is African. And we all know that there are so many resources here. And I think what's important is that as we are shifting at the moment away from carbon-based energy, we're shifting now to new forms of rare earth minerals, the titanium that's being struggled over in Kolobeni, up north of here. A lot of that goes into white paint, but also because it's highly reflective, it replaces lead in the white paint, so it becomes a green mineral. And it's being used in solar panels because it's highly reflective, and it's it's also used in safe, so-called safe sunscreens, etc., etc. So it's a green mineral. We look at Congo, the struggles over cobalt, and I think I wish we had leadership at the moment. And I wish that we in our universities were taking that question forward to build a generation of leaders who are savvy to the kind of ways in which global politics desires and fosters actively corrupt governance. And I think I've had the privilege of spending a week recently with Dr. Mampela Rampele, who keeps reminding, she was with us in Tanzania with our group of students from 5 countries, and she kept reminding the students, you are the ones who are building your world. And our question that we kind of got to within our workshop was, what is the African university we want? And maybe I can stop on that point. What is the African university we want? And how do we build that? If we can get our students in conversation to rebuild the African university, as you at Forte are beginning to do. Neil Roos was telling me about the 50 new posts. That's incredible. Wow, let us build the African university we want, to craft leadership which thinks in different ways and thinks across economy, ecology, humanity, and how we think, and does much more than just a surface decolonization with a whole range of new fancy words. Thank you.
Before you go, I heard there's something to eat. I don't know what to call it, brunch or something. I don't know if it's breakfast or lunch. I on behalf of my dean, Professor Roos, I want to extend our utmost gratitude to Professor Green to make it all the way to come to our small village. I also want to thank the Jabavu family for always ensuring that they are represented during the lectures. Thank you for coming all the way here. And I also want to thank you all, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, for making it. I'm not going to drag the program any longer. You can engage with the presenter on the sides if need be. I thank you all for coming and looking forward to seeing you in our next lecture series. Thank you. Bye-bye.